So as we made our way through the nervous system last time, and we discussed the cells, we discussed the different divisions of the nervous system. Remember, we had central and peripheral. We had somatic and motor. And now when we look in the peripheral nervous system under the motor section, we had the somatic, which is skeletal muscle, and we had the autonomic. And remember, autonomic controls the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular secretions. That's one that's not always added, but it controls that as well. Now, the somatic division in skeletal muscle is voluntary. You're going to control how your body moves, what you grab, how you run, how you walk. But the autonomic division is automatic. It is involuntary. And we described our two divisions of the autonomic nervous system last time. The sympathetic, which is our fight or flight, which I think for most of us is the one we're most familiar with. Again, the example last time was when you're about to go through an intersection and your light is red, so you're waiting. Your light turns green and someone runs their light in front of you and it scares you. Your heart starts thumping in your chest. You white-knuckle the steering wheel. Your breathing increases. That is a sympathetic response to prepare your body for something extremely active. Now, the parasympathetic is rest and digest. Go ahead and write that in. We don't have that listed on our slide. Sympathetic, fight or flight, very active. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. It's what happens when your body is relaxed, when you're asleep. And so this is the totality of the control involuntarily of your body. And whichever one is dominating, that's the condition of your body. Right now, the sympathetic system is dominating over the parasympathetic. Well, most everybody. By the end of lecture, there will be some parasympathetic folks in our class. Now, this illustration shows a real broad overview of the different physiological responses to your body for each one of these autonomic systems. So we already talked about sympathetic fight or flight. Your heart rate increases. Now, it's not like you have to memorize both sets of these, right? Because what is sympathetic compared to parasympathetic? Opposite. So if you remember in sympathetic, your heart rate increases, what's going to be parasympathetic? Decreases. Sympathetic, your breathing increases. Parasympathetic? Decreases. In sympathetic, your pupil of your eye dilates. What's parasympathetic? Constricts. Now, this is a little misleading because there's no easy way to really describe it. Sympathetic, your pupil dilates because you want to get as much light coming into your retina as possible. That's information. When you're sleeping, does it really matter if you're getting light information? Yeah, your pupil doesn't go to a pinpoint. It's just simply in that situation your pupil doesn't dilate. Does that make sense? It's easier just to say constrict because it's opposite. But no, you're not going to look like you're on some kind of freaky drug by having a little pinpoint to your pupil. All right? So heart rate increases. Your digestive system in sympathetic stops. Now this is one that we think sympathetic, fight or flight, very active. Your digestive system in that response stops. The muscles that are processing your food, those peristaltic contractions, stop. The sphincters that allow food to pass from your stomach to intestines and from the small intestines to the large intestines, they shut down. Nothing's moving, nothing's digesting. Because all of the blood that was going to the smooth muscle in your digestive tract is being diverted to where? What muscle's going to get the blood in a sympathetic response? Your skeletal muscle. Because you're about to do something really active. You're either going to be running from something, in which case you've got to have those leg muscles working, or you're going to be trying to kill something to eat it, which means your skeletal muscles are going to be working. So it doesn't matter in a sympathetic response if you finish digesting that under parasympathetic rest and digest, and it's going to be, your digestive system is 110% open for business. Again, as I mentioned last time, that's why if you eat something right before you go to sleep, all of those calories get stored as fat because you're not going to burn them. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. Now, let's get back to central nervous system. And specifically, let's look at the two components, the brain and the spinal cord. If you had to imagine the consistency of the brain and sort of characterize it to someone as to how delicate or how sturdy the brain was, which direction would you go? Is the brain pretty tough? Brain tissue? Is it hard like bone? No. The brain is soft mush. And so your brain has to be protected. That's one reason why we have the skull. If we didn't have this skull, the calvaria, we wouldn't be around very long because of all of the trauma that would happen to our brain. And the same for our spinal cord that's protected by our vertebrae of our vertebral column. But not only do we have these bony shields protecting this delicate, sensitive central nervous system tissue, we also have these coverings that go around the brain and extend down and go around your spinal cord. And starting from the outside working in, we have this really tough connective tissue layer called the dura mater. Dura sounds like durable. And I like that word because the dura mater you cannot tear. In our anatomy dissections, whether you're talking about gross anatomy with a human or you're talking comparative anatomy down the hall where they dissect a cat, if the brain you're trying to dissect is covered by the dura mater, you're going to have to get a scalpel or some very sharp scissors to get through it. That's how tough the dura is. Now, situated beneath the dura mater is a layer that is called the arachnoid layer. The arachnoid. Now, have you ever heard of a word that sounds kind of like arachnoid? Arachnid. What's that? Spiders. So, do you think that has its name because it looks like spiders? It looks like spider webs because you have all these fibers that run through it that have a lot of holes and spaces. And the space beneath the arachnoid contiguous layer is filled with these little webs, and so it's called the arachnoid space. And we're going to have our fluid circulating all throughout these layers as well. Now, the layer on the inside that is directly adhered to the brain itself is called the pia mater. So you can see we've put this material inside of these bony protective shields, and we've covered them with a very durable layer. We've covered them with a very spacious, kind of spongy-looking layer where we see a lot of blood vessels and nerves running through. And then we've got a final covering on the outside that really is going to kind of keep things intact. And the pia mater is probably going to be the one that is most responsible then for the blood-brain barrier and keeping infectious agents out. So our illustration, we can see sort of a side view of the body, and they color-coded these different vertebrae. Do you remember when we talked about skeletal system? What do we call the vertebrae up here in the neck? Cervical vertebrae, and then what's the next group? Thoracic, then lumbar, and down here, sacral. So we have these different flavors of our vertebrae, but in general, if you look through the vertebrae, again, on the outside, you're going to see a tough connective tissue layer, which is the dura. The arachnoid underneath, they're showing you our spinal nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord, and our final layer is the pia mater. Now, if you consider all of the layers sort of collectively together, these are referred to as the meninges. And again, you have these same stacked layers of the brain as well, the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. And if you have an infection, an inflammation, do you remember the last 4 letters of a word for inflammation? I heard somebody mumble it. itis, itis. What do you call inflammation of the meninges? Meningitis. This is what's getting inflamed and infected when we have meningitis. Now, can you kind of understand why that's dangerous? If you have inflammation of the dura mater, is that thing going to be stretchy? Is it going to allow for expansion with all that fluid inside? No. Where's the pressure going to go? It's going to push inward on the spinal cord and the brain, this very soft tissue. And could you go shut that door, please? And that meningitis is going to cause damage because of the inflammatory pressure. That's why it's important to be protected against it. And some meningitis is very contagious, and that's why you had to get your vaccination before you could come to campus. So we've got our bony covering, we've got our layers, our meninges. Now remember our neuroglial cells we talked about last time, for those of you that were here? The nerve glue or supporting cells. We talked about the myelinating cells. And if you had to describe for those that weren't here on Wednesday, how could you describe the myelination of an axon in a very simple layperson's terms? Myelination is what? It's a protective layer. Yes, it is protective, but remember, it speeds up the signal. Is there a better word we could use for myelination?
I was just going to say increases the lightning, so to speak.
Increases the lightning, makes it go faster. Relative to electricity and electric wire. The electrical tape, which is a form of insulation. That was the word I was looking for. So the neuroglial cells can insulate. We talked about those. We have other neuroglial cells that are going to be producing a fluid. And this is, think of this like hydraulic fluid, if you will, and this is called cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid is going to circulate around the brain. It's going to circulate around the spinal cord within these meninges. And in addition to acting as a shock absorber, think of it like a river that's flowing around the castle. You know, the moat of the castle that keeps the soldiers out? Well, this fluid's going to be circulating around, and any pathogen that tries to cross is going to get swept away in the moat, the cerebrospinal fluid, before it can get to and infect our nervous system tissue. And so in our illustration, these neuroglial cells, they're called ependymal cells, that's a freebie. They produce this fluid, and it's going to circulate on the interior of the brain in what are called ventricles. But do you see how these arrows show the circulation around the outside of the brain? And here are the arrows that are circulating down and around and back up the spinal cord. So we've got bones that are protecting. We have tough layers that are protecting. And now we have a circulation of fluid that is protecting us as a shock absorber, one, because fluid doesn't like to be compressed. And secondly, because of the movement in the circulation, we're being protected against pathogens. And it helps create that thing that's called the blood-brain barrier. And this is just one component of that blood-brain barrier. So these ependymal cells, as part of what some people characterize as specialized capillaries, but they're going to secrete the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. And we saw in our previous illustration those cavities on the interior of the brain that are called ventricles. Now understand, you can recycle terminology in biology, because when we say ventricles, what probably is the first place you're thinking about? The heart, right? Well, here we have ventricles that are not associated with heart, they're associated with the brain. And this is where the production of cerebrospinal fluid begins. Now we also have capillaries, of course, within the brain, because all cells have to be close to a capillary. Because capillaries are the only blood vessels that allow for what? Exchange. And so our brain requires oxygen just like all other cells. It requires the removal of carbon dioxide. It requires the removal of other wastes. The requirement of more nutrients such as glucose. But the blood can carry pathogens. So our endothelial cells, they freely allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse, but most other molecules are going to have to be screened and transported through those endothelial cells. Now, in doing so, this is like a bouncer at a club. You're going to make sure that not just everything gets in. Only the right things at the right time can pass. So our endothelial cells of the brain are specialized for transport. The cerebrospinal fluid, again, is creating that movement to ensure pathogens get washed away first, and most do, in fact. And then we also have other cells that are going to be screening this material that's passing through the endothelial cells almost as a double check. The endothelial cells selectively transport, and then these other cells called astrocytes, they also take the material and pass it on to our nervous system cells. So here's an example. Here's our bloodstream. You can see our red blood cells, our biconcave red blood cells. And here we can see the little circles that are being transported out. They're just trying to show that as carbon dioxide. Well, actually, it's glucose. The proteins are much bigger. And then normally in our blood, we can just pretty much get out fairly easily. And in some cells, such as the liver, we have big, huge holes in our capillary cells, and this stuff just goes through the holes like Swiss cheese. But here you can see especially this cell on the bottom here of our blood-brain barrier. It looks like a little triangle. It's actually like a foot. And this foot is on one of those protective cells that help with transport. So not only do the endothelial cells have to transport it, but these other screening cells called astrocytes do also, which contributes yet another level to the blood-brain barrier. So we have 3 or 4 different protective levels. And when you have that many security levels set up, what does that mean about the place that's beyond the barrier? It's very important. And you have to protect it. You have to protect it at all costs. Now, have you heard about these meninges before? Other than a biology class? The dura mater, the pia mater, the arachnoid layers. Is this your first time to really hear about all that? You probably have heard about it and you don't even realize. We talked about prefixes, I think earlier in the semester. What does the prefix epi mean? Above. So our prefix epi means above. What would you tell me the definition of the word epidural would mean? Above the dura. Ladies, do you know what an epidural is? Ladies, are you going to be asking for an epidural? An epidural is where you get the anesthesia that numbs your body right before you have a baby. Right? There are a lot of women that start asking when they can get their epidural as soon as they see the blue line on the test strip. Yeah. They put it between the vertebrae, inject the anesthesia above the dura mater, and that anesthesia spreads throughout the central nervous system depending on how fast the pump injects the anesthesia. So they don't change the level of where they put the needle in, But if they speed up the amount of anesthesia that's being put into the body, it raises the level of numbing. They're wanting to hit you just under the armpits. So basically from the armpits down, you don't feel anything. You can still push and you can still do all those physiological, you just have no feeling, which is a good thing, right? But if you don't put enough in, then that numbing level goes down and you start to feel something. But what's going to happen if you start injecting too much too fast and it gets up into your brain stem? What could happen then? You could croak. Because what two functions are critical that are controlled by the brain stem? Breathing and heartbeat. So it's one of those things that you think, well, we're just numbing so we can have a baby. It's all down here. No, and that's why it has to be monitored very closely. All right? All right, so now we're going to look at the spinal cord first, and we're going to slice it and look at the inside of it. And when you cut the spinal cord and you look on the inside, what we're going to see is two types of tissue. We're going to see white matter and gray matter. Guess how they got their names? That's what it looked like when they cut it open. And in fact, what we see in the white matter versus the gray matter is the gray matter is going to have a lot of cell bodies, a lot of our supportive cells, a lot of our dendrites, but it's not going to have very many axons. Whereas our white matter is loaded. It's almost predominantly axons. Now, last time we talked about the differences in the direction of information flow, but we also talked about another difference. Axons are the only processes that are myelinated. Dendrites are never myelinated. They're never insulated. And so it's that heavily myelinated axon that then gives the white appearance. Whereas you don't have axons and so you don't have myelin, that's why the tissue looks more gray in appearance. So this is a spinal cord, this illustration. Spinal cord is cut in half and you're looking at the cut end of it. Do you see these little lines on the outside? That line right there? That's one of your meninges. That's one of our layers we just discussed. And we've got the space between. It's going to be the arachnoid, and then the pia is right on the surface, this outer surface. You can barely even see it on the spinal cord itself. But you see the H or the butterfly or whatever shape right there in the middle and how it's darker? That's the gray matter. Now this is stained with a different kind of stain to give this brownish yellowish appearance. It's not a freshly dissected spinal cord. But the dark material on the inside, that is the gray, and all of the material on the outside is the white. So the axons are out here. The cell bodies and the dendrites and the interneurons, they're going to be on the inside in the gray matter. Now, similar to what we had with our spinal nerves, you remember we had our sensory nerves coming into the dorsal root, and we had our motor nerves leaving via the ventral root? We can also have a positional designation with our gray matter in the sense that each one of these legs of the H, the upper two here and the lower two here, these are referred to as horns. You see how it kind of looks like a horn kind of coming off there? We have the two dorsal horns on the right and left, and we have the two ventral horns on the lower right and left. The dorsal is where you are going to have the sensory axons coming in. And if there's an interneuron involved, that interneuron cell body is going to be in the dorsal part. But regardless if it's a direct connect from a sensory nerve or an interneuron, the cell body of our motor neuron is going to be down in the ventral horn. So we pass the signal to the motor neuron, and then that axon of the motor neuron is going to leave the ventral horn and go out the ventral root, kind of what we talked about last time. It's part of our reflex arc from sensory to motor as it passes through the central nervous system. All right, let's move our way up. Let's get to the brain itself. And when we look at the brain, we're going to have 3 functional zones. Now, a lot of this terminology stems from embryonic development, when the brain was simply kind of a tube that had dilated regions in it. But we have the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. Basically, back brain, middle, and the front brain. That's what it means, just this positional information as we go through our zones. So our forebrain clearly in front, that's going to be representing a lot of our cerebral cortex, the cerebrum, and then we're also going to talk about this sort of middle region where we start to have some of our ventricles and this big bridge that goes back and forth from the right to left side. That's going to be part of our forebrain. Then, here we have the spinal cord. You see we've got the spinal cord cut off at the bottom. But our hindbrain is going to be basically our brain stem. And at the very top of our brain stem, we're going to have this region that we call the midbrain. And we're going to describe all the different components of these regions as we look further. But again, since we started at spinal cord earlier, we're going to make our way up. So up means hindbrain and brain stem. And as we discussed earlier, with an epidural, if you inject too much anesthesia and it gets into the brain stem, this is where we're going to lose control of breathing and heart rate. But look at these other vital functions of the brain stem. Blood pressure regulation, is that important? Yeah, pretty important. Reflexes, and you may not think of these as reflexes, but coughing, sneezing, and swallowing. I mean, we swallow all the time our saliva, but we don't think about it. We only really think about it when we're eating, or when we're eating and we get choked. Most of the time, we don't even think about swallowing when we eat. We're eating so fast. But then we also have body movements that are coordinated through the hindbrain that are essential for our daily functions and everything we have going on. So what parts are there of the hindbrain? Well, there's our fun word, right? The medulla. You can either think of this as the top part of the spinal cord or the bottom part of the brain stem. And again, many of our functions, heart rate, breathing, that's going to be controlled in the medulla. Then we have that component that's sitting on the very back of our skull, back of the brain, and this is called the cerebellum. And you see here our let me try this one more time. Cerebellum is responsible for coordinating body movements. Go ahead and write that extra word in. Coordinating body movements. Your forebrain, your conscious brain, initiates the movement. But as you can imagine, there's so much going on, so many different things that have to be done, where your arms are, where your legs are, where your feet are, upper legs, lower legs, center of gravity. There's so much information going out to control this movement that almost think about it like a fly-by-wire. Does everyone understand fly-by-wire? Many of our modern airplanes are so complex, especially our stealth planes that aren't very aerodynamic, that a pilot cannot really fly it on their own. There's too many systems they have to control. So a computer coordinates what the pilot is wanting to do with fine movements, and the computer makes it happen. Well, think of your cerebellum as the fly-by-wire, that when your cerebrum says, okay, we're going to run, the cerebellum coordinates everything that you have to do to make running happen. But one more thing is the cerebellum is also going to be responsible for repetitive activities. Let's paraphrase that. The cerebellum is responsible for muscle memory. Have you ever heard muscle memory? So we have some athletes, I think, here today. What's your sport?
Volleyball.
You're tall enough. You spike? Okay. So you have played volleyball and you've spiked the ball how many times in your career? Just guesstimate. A lot. 5,000. Well, that 5,000? So you've spiked it 5,000 times, which means at practice you don't ever spike. You don't ever practice spiking, right?
We do.
Why? You've done it 5,000 times. Why do you practice it?
Get better.
And over and over. You practice it so that you can ingrain all the activities in spiking a volleyball in the cerebellum, so when you have to do it, you don't think about it. Has anyone ever done anything active, an athletic event or a musical concert or a routine dance, where when you finished it, you really didn't remember thinking about the individual components? And it probably was the best performance, the best game you ever had. A lot of athletes say they were in the what? In the zone. That zone is your cerebellum. You've done it so many times that you're flying by wire because you've practiced it over and over and over, but you don't think about it. Has anyone tried to hit a golf ball? Okay, that is all about muscle memory. And even if you've got the muscle memory, you're still going to shank it. And if there's any water within about 5 miles, that's where my ball's going to go. I think it's just magnetic or something. But you understand the muscle memory part? And the coordination and the centralized coordination that happens in the cerebellum. Let me finally get to your question, sorry.
No, you answered it.
Oh, okay. So we've got the medulla, top of the cerebellum, the top of the spinal cord, sorry. The cerebellum on the back. These kind of look like two flowers back here with a part in the middle. And then at the top of the medulla, we have this structure, it's called the pons. It kind of looks like a big date. And as the pons is setting here, this is a connecting bridge. And it's going to help interconnect many of the other higher brain regions, the midbrain and the forebrain. It's going to have a function of connecting them to the hindbrain.
What did you say to write in front of body movements?
In front of body movements, put coordinated body movements. Because your forebrain starts it, but the hindbrain coordinates it. So here, hindbrain, the medulla, the very bottom. You see our cerebellum back here? And again, I said it looked like a flower. Maybe it doesn't really look like a flower. But do you see how in this case we also have white areas? And then we have the gray areas on the outside? What does that look like? If you had to describe this picture, what does it look like? Looks like a tree. You see the branches, the trunk of the tree, and the smaller branches. The early scientists that saw that gave it a name. They call that part of the cerebellum and the way that looks the arbor vitae. What does arbor mean? Tree. We have arbor day. Vitae means life. So literally when you see that, you're looking at the tree of life. I think it's pretty cool how they named it that way. Not all scientific names are cool, but that one is. So as we get at the top of the medulla, do you see this large kind of grape or date looking structure kind of sticking out there? Maybe like a big tonsil. That's our pons. That's the connecting bridge that's interconnecting higher regions to the lower region of our hindbrain. All right, now let's get to the middle part. Again, in the middle part, we are relaying information. We are assembling information that's going up and down. So think of the midbrain almost like a switchboard. And it's the very beginning of where we're going to coordinate movement. The cerebellum really does it, but it starts to begin to happen in the midbrain. But notice what's really happening and really being processed. Visual and auditory information. And the movement of the head and the eyes, that's going to coordinate with what's coming in with our vision and with sound. So the midbrain really is assisting with sort of integrating our senses with movement. Now, we talked about sympathetic nervous system, right? And we talked about sitting at the red light. Has there ever been another time where you know your sympathetic system kicked in? Okay, let's go back to country folks. Now, city people, you can imagine walking down a dark alley, okay? Can you do that for me? But country folks, when your sympathetic system kicks in, it's when you're walking down the dirt road at night. Have we been there? And all of a sudden you hear something big and hairy, and you know what big and hairy sounds like. Little armadillo, that's not bad. Big and hairy, As you're walking along, is this the case? Okay, is this what you do? Walking along, it's dark, dirt road, big and hairy off to the right. You just keep walking and go, oh, that sounded big and hairy. No. You're walking along and you hear big and hairy. What's the first thing you do? Run. Run. Who said run? That's a good one. That's a good one. If you're from the country, I don't know. Maybe we're not smart enough to run. I don't know. We want to find out what it is, right? But the first thing you do is turn your body, your eyes, in the direction of big and hairy. Because your eyes are your most important sense. Because you want that stereoscopic vision of what is going on. Do you think about, oh, that's big and hairy, let me see what it is? No, you instinctively just turn in that direction. And invariably when you do, heart rate is increasing, your respiratory rate's increasing, your pupils are doing what? Dilating, because it's dark, you want as much light as you can see, and your palms start sweating. That's sympathetic response, but that's the reflex that's happening because of those interconnected regions of our midbrain, just above where we see our pons, just above and on top of the brain stem. Now we get to the forebrain, which consists of the cerebrum, and this is pretty much, when we think of brain, we're thinking of cerebrum. We're not necessarily thinking about the cerebellum and the stem and all this other stuff in the middle. But you can also see this curved, almost aerodynamic shape. To me, it kind of looks like one of those bike helmets from the Tour de France. That is going to be the bridge. You have axons that are running from right to left. Because you know that your two hemispheres, the two halves of your cerebrum, are not connected together. This corpus callosum, that's the only bridge that allows information to go back and forth. And then just beneath the corpus callosum, just beneath the bike helmet, we have this enlarged structure, and that's called the thalamus. Thalamus is going to be important, as well as the hypothalamus. Where do you think the hypothalamus lives? Hypo, beneath the thalamus. It's kind of like having a younger sibling. Oh, you're so-and-so's sister. Oh, you're so-and-so's brother. Well, the hypothalamus just sits under the thalamus, so it's like the younger sibling of the thalamus. Unfortunately, that's how we name these at times. So we'll start with the cerebrum. Most highly developed of all brain regions, arguably the most important. You got to have them all, but if you don't have a cerebrum, are you really living? Have you ever had individuals in the hospital from an accident, a stroke, and the docs say there's no higher brain function? They're talking about cerebrum. They're still breathing, heart's still beating, they're still alive, because what part of the brain controls that? The brain stem, the medulla. But this is who you are. Your cerebrum is who you are. It's what you think. And so it is the most highly developed. Have you ever wondered why it's all creased up? Why isn't the brain smooth? Well, by folding the brain inward, you have greater surface area because that's where the cells live. If it were flat and smooth, you wouldn't have as much room to put as many nerve cells in the nerve cell bodies. And so it's important that we have that grooved look to our cerebrum. Now, here we see a different look at our cerebrum. We've basically cut this in half. not right to left half. We've cut it front to back half. A section right down through your ears, if you will. And this is called a coronal section. What does corona mean? Don't say beer. Crown. Corona is crown. And so I think I can remember this section because when you put a crown on, it's usually with your hands beside your head. And so as you slice down and look at the cut regions, here we can see the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. Now, why did they put right on the left side and left on the right side? In biology and medical terminology and literature, everything is based on the patient's right and left. So doctors and nurses are trained to look at the patient and refer opposite of their own orientation. And so here we have a patient's right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and we have this T-shaped or Y-shaped structure right in the middle. That bridge going across the top of the Y, or the top of the T, that is the corpus callosum, with axons going back and forth, right to left, interconnecting both of our hemispheres together. I want you to think back a few minutes when we looked at the cross-section of the spinal cord. All right? Remember the H in the middle of the spinal cord? Was that H on the inside, was it gray or was it white? Gray. It was the dark material, the cell bodies. The white axons were on the outside. Well, as we look at the cerebrum, the higher part of the brain, guess what? It's backwards. Now when we look at the cerebral cortex, which is this outer part, do you see all these folded regions and how it's darker on the outside in our illustration? They've got corpus callosum in yellow, and it's white on the inside. It's just flipped. In the spinal cord, our cell bodies live in the middle, but in the cerebrum, our cell bodies live on the outside, and all the axons are in the middle. Which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because information is either going from the brain down to the spinal cord via axons, or information is coming up to the brain via axons going to the cells, which are on the outside, where you can pack more in because of the folded nature of the cerebral cortex. Now, what does the cerebrum do? Pretty much everything, right? Well, you can't do everything without the midbrain and the hindbrain, but certainly when we look at the cerebrum, we're going to be able to consciously control our skeletal muscles. As you're writing, as you're moving your head, as you're looking, as you're checking your text, all that stuff, you're consciously doing that. We're aware of our surroundings. We know what's going on. We can hear sounds. We're aware of time passing. But we can also have abstract thought. What does abstract thought mean? Abstract thought is it's not something right in front of you. It's not something you're doing right now. I'm having abstract thought almost every minute because I'm hungry. It's terrible. It's terrible. And so right now I'm having abstract thought about eating a Schlotsky sandwich. I literally was, by the way, even before this slide came up. Abstract thought, your dreams, your goals. Do we have any musical folks in here? My wife's a songwriter. How do people come up with lyrics and the music, the tune? I mean, to me, that's like magic. The people that can do this. I mean, was it Bach or no? It was Beethoven that basically claimed the whole symphony came to him in his head, and his problem was just trying to write it all down on paper. Blows me away. People that invent stuff. How do they come up with that? Because your cerebrum can imagine it. But also your cerebrum is critical for memory. And memory is an important part of who and what we are, not just for remembering birthdays and anniversaries, guys. By the way, you got to work on that. Right? But for the test, you've got to be able to remember all of this stuff, including where you use your brain to remember stuff for the test. And that's all part of the cerebrum. All right, so we've looked at the individual components. Now let's look at the gross anatomical aspect, because we have this big cap that we call the cerebrum, but different regions do different things. And we say we have different lobes to our cerebrum. Guess where the frontal lobe is? Anybody want to try that one? That's good, right? Your forehead right here, your frontal lobe. Frontal lobe, speech, conscious thought, and the initiation of movement. This is where you begin talking. This is where your thinking, your being is. This is where I'm going to walk to Schlotzsky's, the movement that's happening. Now let's move back a little bit. As we get close to the top, that's going to be the parietal lobe. I don't want to say hairband, but my daughters used to wear these plastic things that had the teeth, and you push them into your hair and it sits right here on top of your head. Ladies, what is that called? It is a headband? Think of a headband, that's where your parietal lobe is. That's where your parietal lobe is, kind of along the top, starting at about that point where you'd have the headband and going backwards. The parietal lobe, this is where we're going to have a lot of sensory input. Temperature, touch, pain, pressure, somatic sensory about your body. And we're also going to have motor output from the parietal region that's going to be able to respond to that information coming in. So it's kind of a two-way street when it relates to the sensory information. Now, the temporal lobe's different. We've been going front to back. Well, temporal lobe is guess where? On the side of your head where your what do we call this part? Your temples. That's why we call them the temporals, temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is going to be somewhat artistic. Auditory input, sound input. The ability to read and understand written language. Perceptual judgment. We know some people that need some work on their temples, right? That's a bad call. Should have done that. And then finally, as we get to the back of the brain, we have the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is about visual input. It's always surprised me, and I still don't really understand. It's just the way God, nature, whoever you want to ascribe to it, that's the way they invented it. But your eyes are in front. Why is the part of your brain dealing with it in the back? Why wouldn't you put that closer to the front? It's kind of like when you go to work on a car and you want to try to get to the spark plugs, but some designer decided to put it under some stupid manifold that you have to take, you know what I'm saying? It's like, why have that? Why not have that in the front? I don't know. But that's the way it is, and that's where it is.
I was about to say, do you think that it could be because they want to put it as close to cerebellum as possible because when they let you see like a danger, you'll be able to move?
Possibly. I mean, we do know that whether you're talking about an omnipotent creator that understands all this stuff, or if you're talking about evolution, which is survival of the fittest, then there is a survival advantage to having your visual system in the back. Even if we don't understand what that is, there's got to be a good reason why it's developed there. I don't know, maybe it's more protected there. But your eyeballs are in front, that's what's going to get hit first. I don't know. So here's our diagram. This is our front of the brain. There's a parietal, sort of on the top back, occipital in the very back, and then temporal, situated right on the sides. Here's a different view from the actual side. Frontal, parietal, occipital in the back, and then temporal. And what I was saying earlier about that information coming in, all the sensory information that's part of the parietal lobe. Here we have it's called somatosensory, you don't have to write that down. But closely associated with the sensory information and processing coming in is the motor part, the motor cortex, which takes that information, sends it out to respond to whatever that sensory information coming in does. What is this in our illustration? What do you think that is down here? Any guesses what that might be? The other one. Cerebellum. Cerebrum and cerebellum. They sound alike, but they're very different. There have been a number of times I've been lecturing and said one or the other. Just like my children, I go down the list before I get to them. Sometimes I'll do my twins. Sometimes I'll just say, Roma, you know who you are. Come here. Okay. Just make sure to keep that straight on test day. Now, here's kind of an interesting portion of the forebrain. This is going to be in that deeper part, the thalamus, the corpus callosum area. We have a system that is called the limbic system. Have you ever heard of the primitive brain? The one that's controlling emotion and emotional responses? That's going to be part of this limbic system. And we're going to have interconnections between the forebrain and the deeper parts, the midbrain, that pass through this limbic system. So what they've done in this illustration, the cerebrum, they've sort of made it transparent. And again, we've got the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. There's the cerebellum below. And in purple, they have sort of colored in these regions that are components of this limbic system. Now, one of the interesting components is called, not the hypothalamus, but one component of this system, and especially, do you see this curved thing right here? Do you see that curved part? It looks like it's got a body down here and a tail kind of curving around. Anybody ever heard the term hippocampus? Hippocampus, it's a region of the limbic system. Hippocampus is also the genus name of an aquatic organism. Hippocampus is the seahorse. What does that kind of look like? A little bit. Does that kind of look like? Use your the temporal lobe for your perceptual judgment. Maybe if you're on some sort of drug. But anyway, someone somewhere thought that looked like a seahorse, and so they named it hippocampus. Which if you look up seahorse, you're going to see that term, hippocampus. But that's part of the limbic system, emotional responses. Now, in the forebrain, we also have to talk about the thalamus and its younger sibling, smaller hypothalamus. And as we look at these regions, we have to understand that the functions are going to be control. Control of water balance, control of temperature, control of metabolic rate. And all of these are going to be controlled indirectly from the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is going to control the pituitary gland, the master regulatory endocrine gland of the body. So if your cerebrum is the master control of your central nervous system, the pituitary gland, along with the hypothalamus, that's going to be the control of your hormonal system or the endocrine system. And it's going to control everything that relates to homeostasis, water balance, temperature, metabolic rate, reproduction, blood pressure, the whole gamut of what your body has to regulate to stay healthy is going to be partly controlled by the hypothalamus and our hormones. And so some people consider the hypothalamus the hunger center and the thirst center. If you need more nutrients, hypothalamus is going to signal via hormones that you're hungry. If our blood volume is too low, or if our sodium is too high, then our hypothalamus is going to signal the pituitary to secrete hormones that are going to make us thirsty, so that we drink more fluid, increase our fluid intake, increase our blood volume. Again, all of this that we don't think about, it's just a reflex. Now, the thalamus then is going to receive, process, and transfer information going to and from the hypothalamus, which then is going to translate and transfer information to the pituitary. Again, helping control the body. So we've got this big thalamus, the control, and then we've got the hypothalamus, little sort of blue structure. That's the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is underneath there. And that's going to be all those controls related to maintaining the homeostatic balance for all these different factors of our body. Now, what can go wrong with our nervous system? Basically, with nervous system, I wonder how it can ever function as well as it does for as long as it does. So first, has anyone ever had a concussion? Anybody else? Concussion? How weird is a concussion? Or do you remember do you have the concussion because someone told you got a concussion, or do you remember getting the concussion? How did you get your concussion?
I was going up into a deer stand, and my grandpa forgot to say watch out to the metal rod. And as I was going up, I went forward really hard, and it was
How fast were you climbing? You were excited to go deer hunting, I
I was
guess.
scared because there was a hawk coming after us, so I was.
Oh, okay. Sympathetic nervous system. You were jumping in the deer stand and bonged your head on us. Yeah. How'd you get your concussion? Football? Do you remember it? No? My earliest experience was in 7th grade football. I was a quarterback and my center got a concussion. He couldn't remember the snap count. And then finally we were going up to the line in practice after we huddled up. And he asked me 3 times on the way up what the play was. And then when we got up to the line, he turned around and said, "Who are you?" At that point I said, "Coach." Coach, 7th grade, right, little kid? "Coach, Richard ain't right. Richard ain't right." And typically when you get a concussion, especially when you're having trouble with memory, what region of the brain have you damaged? Think memory, the front part of your brain. But in football, a lot of times you get the concussion when you slam the back of your head on the ground. When you slam your head on the ground, inertia is going to be forcing your brain backwards, but your cerebrospinal fluid is building up in the back, so your brain doesn't actually hit the back. But what do you get then? A rebound. That fluid elastically almost pushes your brain into the front of your skull, hitting you there, and then you don't remember your name or how you got the concussion, and your friends tell you all kind of stories after the next couple of days, and you go, "Man, did I really do that? Really? I finished the game?" No. Hopefully they don't let you finish the game.
So is it different if you get one by hitting the top of your head?
Well, you're going to be damaging different regions, yeah.
Because when I got mine, I hit the top of my head.
Okay, what were the symptoms
I don't really.
besides a headache?
I was in the 5th grade, so I don't really.
You don't remember?
It was I had fallen off a bunk bed. I was hanging something up for end of summer camp party, and I fell off the top of the bunk bed and hit the concrete floor head first.
Oh.
I did the same thing on concrete.
Oh, and you got a concussion too.
Yeah, the top of my head. I remember being really dizzy and stuff. It was kind of everything was kind of blurry and everything afterwards.
I was out for a week.
Really?
And the whole world was spinning the whole week.
You notice the female concussion stories are so much better than ours. Football.
Just remember
Took a baseball, deer stand, bunk beds, concrete
So I wouldn't fall asleep. Because we were in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, yeah.
The only one that could check me out was the nurse at the camp.
Was anybody so concussed they had nausea? You were? You couldn't stop throwing? My son in football, again, boring. Everybody gets concussed in football. Where did you get yours? See, boring. But he was dry heaving. He wasn't actually to the point, but he was dry heaving, and maybe that's sort of one of those signs of that. And it's not necessarily right away. It takes a little while to kind of build that up. You know you got rung up pretty good. But then if you start having any of these others, especially the confusion part or blurred vision, you need to go see a doc pretty quick or a trainer. Yeah, but definitely get out of the game, whatever's going on. Now, if we injure our spinal cord, and we talked about these a little bit last time. We talked about injuring too high in your cervical, then it's just game over at that point. But you probably heard of a paraplegic and a quadriplegic. Let's understand the differences. A paraplegic, this is going to be weakness and paralysis to the legs or the lower part of the trunk of the body. Whereas a quadriplegic, quads how many? 4. And what 4 are we talking about? 2 legs, 2 arms. That's our 4. So here we're talking about paralysis basically from the neck down. Para is legs, quad is, we're going to say neck down. Neck up, yeah, game over. You're talking a fatal condition. Now for infections, we already talked about meningitis. Encephalitis, this is another bad one. Itis, we know inflammation, right? Encephalon is a term that means brain. So encephalitis is swelling or inflammation of the actual brain tissue. And again, as your brain starts to swell, where's it going to go? It's got nowhere to go, right? Skull's not going to move. Skull's not going to stretch. So you're going to be putting increased pressure on the brain, and you could really do severe damage to the brain in that case. A lot of times if they can't slow it down, if they can't treat it, they will go in and put a window. They will cut out a section of the skull to give the brain room to expand. And you can imagine you're cutting through that bone. Now your brain and the meninges are susceptible to infection. It's just, I mean, that's a last-ditch effort at that point.
I have that.
You have?
My school is cut into 16.
I was like, she's got encephalitis. Everybody over here? No.
My school is cut into 16 different pieces.
They had to window you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was bad.
So, well, we're glad you made it.
Yeah.
We're glad you're here.
I don't know, like, if this is possible, but, like, if a baby were to get encephalitis before, like, their fond mouths are closed, would their, like, skull, like, get bigger because they could, like, if
Right, so think back to the bones, okay? The skull is not intact at birth. You've got the bones that are floating, the sutures haven't fused together, and there's the spaces, the fontanelles. If a baby got encephalitis that early, then yeah, the bones could expand a little bit, depending on how early or how late it was. They fuse fairly quickly, but I think we got greater problems to worry about with encephalitis with a newborn, because the brain's not fully developed. I mean, even into early childhood and beyond. I mean, there's some adults that the brain's not fully developed, if we can just talk, you know what I'm saying? So early infections of the nervous system can be debilitating for the rest of your life. So even though it might have room to expand, we got greater problems to think about. Rabies. Man, why are we talking about rabies? Well, guess what? A viral infection of the brain. That's why if you get bitten by an animal and you are not sure, don't take chances. Now, the series of injections you have to get aren't a whole lot of fun. So it's better if you can get the animal and have the animal diagnosed to see if they have rabies or not. So you may or may not have to go through the regimen of injections. But look at this. You may not know for 6 months. So don't take any chances when it comes to rabies. Epilepsy, we know of people. We might not have seen it directly, but I think we understand what seizures look like. And this is just involuntary control, brain activity. It can lead to unconsciousness. And I know that we all are caring people. We all want to help out when we can. But you always hear about someone having a seizure that they might bite their tongue. They might bite their tongue off. Whatever you do, if someone is having a seizure, and this is just a little bit of common sense, but when you're under the stress, the sympathetic fight or flight, you're not thinking quite as clearly. If someone's having a seizure and you're going to render aid, do not put your finger in their mouth. They might have something in their mouth. You might think you're going to try to clear their airway. Don't put your finger, because they could bite your finger off. Because one of the strongest muscles in your body is your jaw muscle, closing your mouth. All right? So just do not try to render aid that way.
Why is it that they want you to hold their head?
I think just to keep them from banging their head if they start shaking, because again, you could get a concussion at that point. Right? Parkinson's disease. Typically see this in elderly individuals, although Michael J. Fox, the actor, he's not young anymore, but he had early onset Parkinson's. And with Parkinson's, it's a degenerative disease of the neurons in your brain that secrete the neurotransmitter called dopamine. And again, this is going to help coordinate movements. And when you lose the coordination, that's what happens. You get these jerky movements instead of the smooth movements like we normally do. Now, there's been limited success with using stem cells or fetal cells that produce dopamine and transplanting into animals, but it's nowhere near the time where we could have clinical trials and it being applied to humans. I mean, they're trying gene therapy, but we've not yet arrived at a way that we can cure Parkinson's. It's not possible yet. One of the most, I hate to say debilitating, but one of the most difficult to deal with if you have a loved one that is elderly and develops Alzheimer's syndrome is the fact that it says mental impairment. But have we experienced Alzheimer's, individuals with Alzheimer's? The best way I can describe it is they disappear. The people just disappear. They don't recognize you. They communicate as if they're living in a different time and a different place. And it's hard to see your loved ones not even recognize their surroundings, not even know what day or what year or what decade it is even. So it's a difficult time. And Alzheimer's attacks the limbic system portion of our forebrain. Again, you're having neurons that are losing their function because of the accumulation of these plaques, this material inside the cells, and it is absolutely, it's a horrific experience. I watched my grandmother when I was younger with this, and it's not fun. But invariably, all of our lives are going to be touched by Alzheimer's at some point because we haven't gotten to a cure for that yet.